pay tribute to the 2,100 men who made Camp Brown their home for a few weeks in 1862 before they left on the train to go defend our Union. The President Lincoln at the time, July 1st, 1862, told the states that he needed 300,000 men. This is after they'd already sent thousands of men early on in the war. We weren't doing so well on our side of the Mason-Dixon line, so we needed more men. And so the states were given their allotments, and at that time, U.S. Congressman Reuben Fenton was in charge of getting 2 regiments together for Chautauqua County and Cattaraugus County. And so he went around and was very enthusiastic, and thousands of 3,000 people came to a bonfire in Stockton. This is before gala days. So I mean, and what, there are 130-some thousand people in the county now. How many were then, you know? A lot of people were very, very excited about helping save our Union. And so they needed Camp Brown for just a few weeks in August to get everyone gathered together to get the basic training done, which is nothing like boot camp now, and then take them, send them off to the war. And so Camp Brown here was named after James M. Brown, who had was a colonel in the 100th New York Volunteers and had lost his life the previous year. And so they named the camp after him. However, Camp Brown was an agricultural fairgrounds, much like you think of Dunkirk Fairgrounds and the different fairgrounds around. And it was pretty big, had a lot of trees on one side, which is probably the area over here. And something, an article I read said that Cole Avenue bisected Camp Brown, so you can see how, or the fairgrounds, so you can see how large it was. And it had a number of buildings, but the largest building was Flora Hall, and they were able to put 250 bunks in there. And then they built another building that was 28 feet by 80 feet and put 250 bunks in there. And then they built a dining hall. They connected some buildings and made it a dining hall. They could seat 510 people at a time for dinner. That's a lot of potatoes to peel, don't you think? And so they had the big kitchen in the back to cook it all. And it had a fence around it, a high fence to guard the men from leaving when they weren't supposed to. So eventually, so what I think is impressive is President Lincoln issues his command July 1st that he needs all these men. And by August 2nd, Chautauqua County and Cattaraugus County have filled 2 full regiments. That's 2,000 men. And they weren't going to go that high, but they went over they're only supposed to get 1 regiment. But they did so well that they had 8 extra companies. All right, let's get 2 more companies and make a regiment. And that's what they did. Plus they had 100 men who were part of the 7th New York sharpshooters who went off with the 112th. So the 2 regiments were the 112th New York Volunteer Infantry and the 154th New York Volunteer Infantry. And the 154th is connected with Cattaraugus County, as are the, I should say the 7th sharpshooters are connected with the 154th. The men weren't as disciplined as we are now in our boot camps, of course. What's interesting is they could choose to drill or not. They could whine and stay. We have letters where this one man is saying that his bunkmate chose, he's always sick apparently, and he never gets up to go drill very much. They didn't have their guns. They didn't get their guns until they were in Elmira, headed towards New York and then out to the war. Their food was good for about the first 2 weeks. From what I'm reading, and then it kind of went downhill really quick. And the families could visit whenever they wanted. There's an account where there were 1,000 people visiting one day. Literally, 1,000. Women and children, moms and dads, girlfriends, coming to visit the men. And the men could leave for a day, but it was kind of hard to get your pass. But there was also other accounts where there'd be a couple dozen of them leaving every day, whether they were allowed to or not, but they would wait for nighttime when you couldn't see them, and then they would go out the fence. By the time September 12th rolled around and the 112th was going to leave, there were 2,100 men in camp. I don't know where they all slept. Eventually, they were officially mustered in over the few days before September 12th, 1862 came along. They were given 1/4 of their federal pay. They were given $25. Many of them chose to parcel out their money, I should say, so that some went to their families and some went to them. They also received a $50 gift from New York State for joining up. That was the incentive. And they also received their monthly pay, $13. So they were rolling in dough when they left. They were in good stead. So I'm going to read a little bit about an account. Now this account is it's written down 43 years later. It's written down in 1904. But it was in the Jamestown Evening Journal, in 1905. And it's from a gentleman who watched them leave. Now when I say them, I mean the 112th. I stood on the bluff at the corner of 1st and Cherry Streets and saw the 112th New York Volunteers and 7th Company of Sharpshooters board the train which carried them to the front, and up to that day, Jamestown had never known such a day in all its history. The march to the station of the Atlantic and Great Western Railway was taken up with bands playing, flags flying, and cannons booming. Nearly every home in the county was represented, either directly or indirectly, in the 112th or the Company of Sharpshooters. And the streets of the village were simply thronged with fathers, mothers, brothers, aunts, uncles, cousins, sweethearts, and friends. The troops marched down what is now Warren Street to South Main. So South Main was still there. Warren, I think, was Foote Avenue. Through a section marked by woods and fields with but few houses, and up Main to 1st Street. Hence they proceeded to the station and boarded the cars. The crowd in the meantime swarmed about the trains, and just before departure, some of the boys took their sweethearts on the platform with them. It was necessary to back the train in order to allow the girls to get off, and before the soldiers got away, this had to be repeated 4 or 5 times. There were many touching scenes at the station. It will bring tears to the eyes of some of those who were there to recall the parting which took place 43 years ago today. So it was a huge deal when these guys marched down through town. You can imagine 1,000 men marching. I'm not even sure they had uniforms at that time. That was a big deal too, I found out. They got their uniforms. They wrote their mother and said, if I get my uniform when I'm supposed to, I'm coming home to show you. They don't even ask permission. They say, I'm coming home to show you. It's really funny. But these men, they were excited to defend their country. And we know how awful the Civil War was in retrospect. 500,000 men, 600,000 men from our country died in this war. And many of the men who left here never came back. And the ones who came back couldn't farm again, they couldn't work again, and they were damaged in one way or the other, mentally, physically. It was just a very, very disturbing time for them to go to this war. So the 154th also left, and they left on September 29th. So they were there just a little bit longer, and they had the same kind of fanfare when they left, and all their Cattaraugus families came to see them go to the train, and off they went. And the men went to Elmira, and that's where they got their guns, and then they headed towards New York City. They're picking up men all along the way. It was a big party, I do believe, until they got to the really tough spot, until they got to Virginia. And they fought in many different battles, both companies, or both regiments, excuse me. But again, we remember that they were the farm boys and the merchants and the clerks from our area. And they were all ages, too. They were young, 17. They were older. They were 40. They were all different ages here.
Very nice, Joni.
Very good.
Thank you, Joni.